Hello out there, my name is Milesy and welcome to my channel. Today I've got some perforated plastic and some nice bright pink floss, and we are going to talk about stitching in the same direction and what that means. Now, depending on who you ask, what that means might change in definition, so let's go ahead and talk about a few different ways that gets used. And the most common way it gets used, I think, are in relation to your individual stitches. And so what that means is that when you've got your stitch and you're starting it out, the bottom half will be slanting one way in that direction, and the top half will naturally go the other direction. And if you're using tent stitch, it's a little bit easier to keep track of, but when we do the next stitch now, we want to make sure that the bottom half of the stitch goes the same way it did before. So it goes this way, and the top goes this way. And I'll do this a couple of times on a bigger scale just to show you a little bit more easily. So the bottom half will go one direction, that way, and the top goes over it in the opposite direction. And we want to just do that every single time. Make sure that the bottom half always goes one direction and the top half always goes the other. Now, there's no rule saying that you have to do the bottom half this same direction. You could choose to do your bottom half in going this way and your top half's going that way, but you want to make sure that you're always consistent. That's the key, is consistency. So here now we've got two stitches going one way and two stitches going the other way, which you can't see too well here, but if I were to come down over here where I've already done some smaller stitches and do these ones backwards relative to how I've already done them, that is. And try not to get that caught on the corner. That's always super fun. And this feels super weird doing it. Eventually you will just kind of get used to it. Now I'm going to do a few different rows alternating, and that will make it easy for you to see what I mean coming up. And now we're going to go back the other way. Here. Now it's not as easy to see in those bigger stitches, but here in the smaller stitches, you might be able to see that the middle row doesn't reflect light the same way, because I've got my light over my shoulder kind of off in that direction, shining on, and it catches these, the top and the bottom rows. It catches those stitches and makes them a little bit brighter, whereas if this were a bigger patch, you'd see a really dull line because the light has nothing to bounce off of. Whereas right here it's catching on the top, and on the middle one you can think of it as it's just skidding over the top. It has nothing really to bounce off of. So that's really why it's most important in this regard to make sure that your stitches are always going the same way, because it just doesn't look as nice. Now, the other way that people mean when they say to make sure your stitches are always going the same way is to either always stitch in rows or always stitch in columns. And typically when I am stitching any piece, I tend to stitch in columns. Very rarely will I stitch in rows, and usually only if there's like a tiny little section on what I'm working on that doesn't really work to be stitched in a column, which is one of those things that's hard to explain, but when you get a pattern that has an area like that, you can kind of just tell. So I've got one row here Now I'm going to come back up and do the other row. And you could do this the other way, where you do your row, half the bottom stitches going up, and then do the other half coming back down. I did that backwards, but you know what I mean. Which makes it a little bit easier to keep track of what you're doing. I like to do a whole stitch at a time just because it works better for me. I don't even really think there is really much of a reason. I thought there was, and then as soon as I tried to say what the reason was, I realized I didn't have one. So it's just one of those things, like so many things with cross stitch, it just kind of comes down to preference. So here we go. We have a couple of columns here rather, that have been stitched in the same direction, meaning they have both been stitched in columns. Now I'm going to do a row going this way, and it's still going to be attached, but it's just a row, and you can see that I'm kind of having to change where I put my needle. It's a very subtle change, but it makes a big difference. So I've done this, and now, because I'm putting them kind of in the top just to make sure that they can go the same way, or I could make it easier on myself, and this is the third way. There's a secret third way here, where I'm always putting the needle through the top holes and going down. I could change directions, still stitching in a row, and decide that I don't like coming up through what I've already stitched. I could decide I want to always stitch down through what I've already stitched, and I can change the direction of my stitches going this way. Now, where this is important is that how you pull your floss on the back of your project, and I talked a little bit about this in the tent stitch video. How your floss gets pulled on the back of your project can kind of determine how your stitches lay. So I have switched this up just ever so slightly. Now, instead of my floss being pulled diagonally on the back, it's always going to be in even rows. And I wish I could flip this over. I'll flip it over on the end and show you. But here we go. We're just always going to kind of be doing this. And now I'm going to go back and do this. So now I don't want to put my needle up through what I've already stitched, and now I'm pulling down in diagonal, so these stitches are changing on the back again ever so slightly. Ever so slightly. And this doesn't seem like it would be that big of a deal, honestly, but it can very subtly affect your coverage, the same way that it can affect the way your tent stitch looks, because the corners of the floss are being pulled in a different direction. Especially on fabric, that means that it can pull the entire thread in the wrong direction and not give you coverage as full as you would like. But generally, to keep that from happening, you want to pull diagonally away from where your needle went. So we come up here and we go down here. Now obviously we can't go diagonal from there, so if we go down, we come up through here, and the top stitch, which is arguably again the more important stitch, when we come up from where we've already stitched like this, we have pulled that top one diagonal, and that will keep that stitch diagonal. Whereas if we come like this and I've gone across this way, and if I come up through here, I've pulled this stitch on the bottom ever so slightly in that direction by coming up here. And now if I come up from the bottom here, this is not being pulled diagonal relative, there we go, I got it, to itself. It's not being pulled this way, it's being pulled that way, which can ever so slightly affect the way that lays down. So as much as possible, it's always a good idea to have the thread on the back going the same direction as the top thread. So I've gone down through this hole, and if I come up through the same hole again, that stitch will lay at a perfect 45-degree angle every time. So that's pretty important too, just because it can help your coverage a little bit. And it's one of those things where if you do it often enough, you'll be able to just start doing it without any thought at all. So now we've done 2 vertical columns and 2 rows, and I'm just going to go through and fill in the rest in columns now, because why not? And sometimes doing it this way, kind of going everywhere, can be a nice break from the monotony, especially if it's a really big section. So that can be pretty tempting. It can be, for sure. The problem though is that, again, you do kind of wind up with your stitches not always going in the same direction on the back, like we were just talking about, because changing the direction, whether vertically or horizontally, changes the way that you place your stitches. I think that's a good way of wording it. And another little thing when you change the way that you place your stitches is that sometimes they can use more floss than the other way. And I'm not really sure which way might use more floss. It definitely feels like doing it one way over the other does, though. So we're just going through here and filling this up. And this is a lot more evident, again, on fabric where you're going to be pulling on it. I'm just using the plastic to make it easier for you guys to see exactly where I'm placing the needle. But you can kind of see here, even though it is 2 strands, it does have fairly decent coverage, but you can kind of see in these areas where I've switched up between rows and columns, there would be, and there kind of is, a very kind of distinct line right here. I don't know how well it's coming across on camera, but up close in person, there is a distinct line there where things have changed. And then there's another one that's forming right here. So I have 3 separate unique blocks of stitching. So that's why you always want to make sure you're stitching either in columns or in rows, but try not to mix up and do both. So that is actually 3 different ways that people can mean when they talk about always making sure that you're stitching in the same direction, because why be easy and have different words for different things? I don't know, but there we go. Hopefully that can clear some stuff up. I know that's one of the things that does get talked about a lot in beginner circles, and then kind of treated as if you should know automatically the difference between all 3. But most commonly what people refer to is either making sure the top halves of your stitches are always the same, or always stitching in columns versus rows. Although the 3rd way, making sure that the backs of your stitches and just the process of your stitches, that's a good way to word it, are the same as well. But I hope this is helpful, because it's one I've been meaning to cover for a while, and I just realized today that I hadn't. So I hope you guys found this helpful. If you did, let me know. Also, there is a question on the community page right now that I would like your guys' thoughts on. So go ahead, jump over there, and let me know what you think. But thank you guys so much for watching. Go ahead and give the video a like and a share if you found that helpful, because that helps me out. And I will see you guys next time. Bye!